For the last couple of weeks, our gospel readings have been taken from the portion of the Gospel of Matthew called the Sermon on the Mount. Arguably one of the greatest speeches, even if it was an actual speech, it's written out in the Gospel of Matthew. It is considered one of the greatest speeches of all time and a very famous part of the Gospel of Matthew and the ministry of Jesus. We've been getting a piecemeal over the last 2 weeks, and this week we get Jesus' application of the law, his assertion he did not come to abolish but to fulfill, and in a series that are called his Antitheses, he goes into a series of sayings of, "You have heard it said, but I tell you." And it would appear he's extending the law, accentuating it, intensifying it, not just as a matter of action, but a matter of inner disposition. But it has, however, I must admit, caused a great deal of headache and consternation for many people who follow Christ, who try to live a good moral life. For example, if I had a nickel for people who speak to me, either in and out of confession, that somehow their feelings, their emotions constitute sin, and then quote this passage of the gospel, I probably would not need to be in this job. I could probably retire. But maybe that's the reason I do. Because how often have I heard people say, I grow angry, or they confess their anger as if it were a sin. And when I or any other priest say to them, well, anger itself is not a sin, they immediately quote this gospel. Well, Jesus said, if you grow angry, you've committed murder. Well, on the one hand, if that were true, then one would think that God is an unbelievably rigid and strict God, that even the emotion would constitute something as serious as murder. But what we often need to look at is not only those sayings of Jesus, the quick quotes that he has in this passage, but also the context and the follow-up. He says, if you grow angry, you are liable to judgment. But then he goes on, speaking harshly, alienation within the community, and even the point of going to court, where he says, you will be handed over to the guard who will throw you into prison. Well, why will you be the one handed over to the judge who will hand you over to the guard who will throw you into prison? The answer is obvious, because you are the guilty one. You are the guilty one in this particular scenario that Jesus is giving. In other words, he's speaking of an anger that leads to actions that put you in legal jeopardy. How often have we heard of such things as crimes of passion, where someone's emotions have become so overwhelming that they completely lose control? They're still liable to judgment. They are still held responsible for their actions, but we call them crimes of passion because it was just a rage or a sense of feeling that completely overwhelmed them. And that is what Jesus is talking about here. Not just simply growing angry and making it equal to the commission of murder or killing, but an anger that leads to actions that cause alienation within a community or a family, or even puts one in legal jeopardy. In other words, he wants us to know where the temptations lie. It says you shall not kill, but he doesn't want us to get to the very threshold of committing an infraction of the law before we stop and realize we can't commit it. He wants us to know where our temptations lie and what leads to that, so that we can exercise that self-control and discipline that is appropriate to being his follower. Another popular one, you shall not commit adultery. And then there's the distinction of committing adultery in one's heart. And again, how often have I, as a priest, in and out of confession, where people say that they've committed adultery in their heart? And usually when I ask them a little more detail, not to get into the lurid details of it, obviously, but when I explain what exactly they mean, more often than not, it means little more than a passing glance at a provocative billboard. But we look at the follow-up of that particular teaching, committing adultery in one's heart, and what does Jesus say? Now, in other parts of the gospel, we hear Jesus use other body parts in this example. If your foot is your undoing, cut it off. If your tongue is your undoing, cut it off. But in this particular case, he is only speaking of your eye, if that is your undoing, and your hand, if that is your undoing. And he does it in the context of committing adultery in your heart. In other words, you're looking at something with your eye, and you're doing something with your hand. And I hope I don't need to get any more specific than that. But again, it's not just simply a passing glance at something provocative, which is something that's virtually unavoidable in a society such as ours today. But there's the action that goes along with it, and a technicality. One might say, well, I'm not really committing adultery in the technical sense with someone else. But Jesus does speak of a disposition that one has that can lead to a different kind of action that does constitute committing adultery in one's heart. Not just simply a passing glance at a provocative billboard or a provocative image. Again, he gives another example. Do not take a false oath. This is perhaps one of my favorite of the antitheses of Jesus, because at the end, when you think of it, it's a very practical piece of advice. Say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. In other words, why does one need to take an oath at all? The commandment is don't take a false oath, but Jesus brings up the question, why would we take oaths at all? And the answer is simple. Because we have a penchant for not telling the truth. And in the end, Jesus says, say yes when you mean yes, no when you mean no, so that we don't have to take oaths at all. We don't have to swear at all. Because we are not known as people who lie, but rather people of the truth, people who tell the truth, people whose word means something, people whose word is worth something. And there's where he gives perhaps the most practical and straightforward: do not swear at all. Just simply mean what you say. And as his followers, we should be known for that. We should be known as people who are truthful, not people who need to take an oath, let alone have to be told not to take a false oath. And so Jesus is not necessarily accentuating and intensifying the law. He's giving very practical applications as to why we should follow the law, not as a matter of words that tell us what to do and what not to do, but inner dispositions that we all should have, not just as his followers, but as people created in the image and likeness of God. And in the end, where he says, especially through St. Paul, that we don't need the law, he's not saying it because it's now a free-for-all, and that we're saved in virtue of Jesus alone, and anything goes because we've been saved. He's saying we don't need the law to tell us what to do, because we already have that inner disposition as followers of Christ, that we are already doing it. Because we've reached that inner maturity as followers of Christ, that we don't need an exterior law to tell us what to do and not to do, because we are already doing it. Best example, I suppose, is as we grow up. Mommy and Daddy hold our hand and tell us we must look both ways before we cross the street. Once we are adults, do we really need Mommy and Daddy to hold our hand and tell us to look both ways when we cross the street? No. We do that automatically, although sometimes driving through the city here you wonder if there are people who do that, even though they are adults. But again, we have an inner disposition to know to exercise personal safety and safety of others. It's the same thing with regard to the law. Jesus doesn't abolish it, he fulfills it. He still demands our obedience of it, but an obedience that is born not simply because the law tells us what to do and what not to do, but as followers of Christ and people made in the image and likeness of God, he calls on us to do it from within. To know where our temptations lie, to know what leads us into that disposition that causes us to sin, to not look for technicalities and loopholes so that we can say, well, technically we really didn't break the law as it's written, but that in a true honesty of spirit and maturity of heart, we are known for being people who obey the law of God, because it bubbles up from within us. And we do it from an interior disposition, nourished by grace, of a people who follow Christ and recognize that we are born and made in the image and likeness of God.